Hi, I'm Paul Peterson.
I'm Chris Sun Liu. Today, we'll be discussing judicial review. Part 1 of the lecture is establishing judicial review. So let's start off by just defining the term. What is judicial review?
Well, judicial review gives the power of the courts to declare laws of Congress and laws of the states unconstitutional. The Supreme Court has the ultimate word. A good example of it is Obamacare, or the Affordable Care Act, which did go to the Supreme Court in the Sebelius case, and the Supreme Court ultimately decided that most of the law was constitutional, though there was one provision that they said was unconstitutional. So that's really significant. Here was a law passed by Congress, signed by the president, which could have been overturned by 9 men and women on the Supreme Court. So it's really the most important power of the Supreme Court.
Well, who has the power of judicial review?
Well, you're right to ask me that question, Chris, because I was a little bit misleading there. Any court has the power of judicial review. It's not just the Supreme Court. Even a state court or a local court could declare a law of Congress unconstitutional. An example of that is the Vergara decision. In Vergara v. California, Los Angeles County Superior Court Judge Rolf True declared that a state law in California violated the federal Constitution. The law said that teachers had to be given tenure after 17 months of teaching, and this judge decided that that law was contrary to the U.S. Constitution. So any judge has the power of judicial review.
Before we go on and go in more depth about judicial review, let's talk a little bit about the American court system. How do all these judges fit in? What does the American court system look like today?
Yeah, well, that's a good question, because you wonder exactly how all these judges fit together into one federal and state court system. So if you look at this slide here, you can see that the state trial courts are really important. That judge out there in California, who was a state trial court judge, is like many, many other judges in the United States. He hears cases in the first instance, and most of the cases that take place in our court system start out in these state trial courts. But now those decisions by those judges can be appealed to the state appellate court, and Judge True's decision is going to be appealed. And then it goes up to the state Supreme Court, also called the State Court of Last Resort, and ultimately it can go to the U.S. Supreme Court. That's the state court system. And then there's the federal court system, which is completely independent and separate, although connected together by the Supreme Court. You have U.S. district courts that hear cases, although many fewer cases than the state courts. They can go to the appeals court if somebody doesn't like the decision that is made at the district court level and they think they have a chance of overturning it. And then it can even go on to the U.S. Supreme Court. So we'll be talking about this court system again and again, but keep this slide in mind because it does give you the overall picture.
What is the constitutional basis that established the U.S. court system?
Well, the state court system pre-exists the Constitution. It comes out of the colonial period where every state had its own judicial system. But the federal courts had to be created by the Constitution, and it was one of the issues at the convention. How are we going to set up this federal court system? Do we even want a federal court system? Well, in the end, they compromised, and they said the judicial power shall be vested in one Supreme Court and in such inferior courts as the Congress may from time to time ordain and establish.
When did Congress set up these inferior courts?
Well, they did it immediately. The very first Congress that met after the Constitution was adopted passed the Judiciary Act of 1789, and that law is still good law today. It affects the way in which the courts operate today, the Judiciary Act of 1789.
Now let's talk about judicial review again. Does the Constitution explicitly give the Supreme Court this power?
Well, some people think it does, but the language is more ambiguous than you would think, Chris. If you read the Constitution, and everybody should read the Constitution who's taking this class, the Constitution says, "The Constitution and the laws of the United States shall be the supreme law of the land, and the judges in every state shall be bound thereby. Anything in the Constitution or laws of any state to the contrary notwithstanding." Now, you notice that this phrase in the Constitution says nothing about judicial review. It doesn't say that the courts have the power to declare laws of Congress unconstitutional. It only says that the Constitution and the laws of the United States shall be the supreme law of the land. One way of looking at this is just simply affirming that the federal government is superior to the state governments, and it really doesn't have anything to do with judicial review. But the way it's been interpreted by the courts is that this clause gives the courts the power of judicial review, the power to declare laws of Congress unconstitutional.
Given the unclear language in the Constitution about judicial review, when was it decided that the Supreme Court has this power of judicial review?
Well, this is the most important case ever decided by the Supreme Court. It's called Marbury versus Madison. It was decided in 1803. It's a pretty bizarre case. It follows the election of 1800, which was one of the most conflictual elections in history. A lot of people think that Bush v. Gore is the most conflictual election in American history, but it isn't. The election of 1800, Thomas Jefferson defeated John Adams, and John Adams had been president. The Federalists had been in power for the entire period since the Constitution had been adopted. It was the first time in American history that power changed from one group to another, and that often provokes of civil violence. And civil violence was a possibility in 1800, and it's one of the great events in American history that we had a peaceful transition of power. But that didn't mean it wasn't an issue that was very bitterly fought. Now, the way it comes up in the court system is that John Adams had, just before he left office, appointed as patronage certain justices of the peace for the District of Columbia. And John Marshall, who was Secretary of State under John Adams, signed the commission, but he forgot to deliver it. And so when Jefferson came to power, his Secretary of State, James Madison, canceled the commission. Now, poor Mr. Marbury was one of these justices of the peace who lost his job. So he goes to the Supreme Court and he says, I should be the justice of the peace. So you can see this is a pretty trivial case, but it's a trivial case in the context of a very conflictual election.
How did Chief Justice Marshall decide the case?
Well, he was very shrewd in the way he decided the case. He said that Marbury was correct. He should have this job, but the Supreme Court doesn't have the power to enforce this right, because part of the Judiciary Act of 1789, this law that we just talked about, is unconstitutional. Now, why it's unconstitutional is too complicated to go into here, but it did declare a part of a law unconstitutional, thus asserting the power of judicial review.
Okay, if the Judiciary Act of 1789 says one thing, but the Constitution of the United States says another, which one is to take precedence? What is Marshall's reasoning?
Well, Marshall says that the higher law always takes precedence over the lower law. Now, ordinarily, when we think about which law takes precedence, it's the most recent law. If somebody says that you can't sell liquor in your town, and then they change the law and says you can sell liquor, well, okay, so the new law supersedes the old one. And the Judiciary Act actually comes later than the Constitution. So you might say, okay, the Judiciary Act supersedes the Constitution. But Marshall said, no, the U.S. Constitution is a higher law. It supersedes state laws, it supersedes congressional laws. The highest law of the land is the U.S. Constitution, and everything must conform to that, and the judges have the power to decide that. That is judicial review.
Professor Peterson, how would you sum up the concept of judicial review and the case of Marbury versus Madison?
Well, the case is pretty bizarre, but it does establish a principle that has endured down to the present time. The Supreme Court today declares laws of Congress unconstitutional. What's written in the Constitution itself is pretty ambiguous, but the principle was established in Marbury versus Madison, and we're living with it today.
Well, that now raises the question of how the Supreme Court interprets the Constitution. We'll look at that in the next part of this lecture.